Hey there, horror enthusiasts. Today, we're going to dive into the world of camping horror, where the chills and thrills are in full swing. So, if you're a fan of the spine-tingling, the pulse-pounding, and the downright scary, then camping horror is definitely your cup of tea. Thanks for joining us today, and don't forget to follow and subscribe for more thrilling content. Stay spooky, my friends. I've been a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service for about 5 years now. It's not exactly the kind of job you'd think would be exciting, but trust me, it has its moments. I've seen some shit that would make your hair stand on end. Lost hikers with broken legs, crazed survivalists living off the grid, even the occasional meth lab hidden deep in the woods. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found that night. It all started with a call about a missing hiker. A young guy named Kyle went out for a day hike and never came back. His car was still at the trailhead, but there was no sign of him. It was getting dark, and a storm was rolling in, so we knew we had to move fast. The rain was coming down in sheets by the time we got to the trailhead. The wind was howling through the trees, and the thunder was so loud it felt like the whole mountain was about to come down on us. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, first aid kit, GPS, and headed out with my partner, Mark. The trail was muddy and slippery, and the rain was making it hard to see. We were hiking for about an hour when we came across Kyle's backpack. It was lying on the ground, ripped open, with its contents scattered everywhere. My heart sank. This wasn't good. "Mark, over here!" I shouted. He came over and took a look. We both knew what this meant. Something bad had happened. We continued searching, but the rain was getting worse. The wind was whipping the branches around, and the thunder was deafening. We were about to call it a night when I heard something. A faint rustling sound coming from the trees. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mark. He nodded. "Yeah, what was it?" I shrugged. "I don't know." "Let's check it out." We followed the sound, pushing our way through the thick undergrowth. The rain was soaking us to the bone, and the cold was starting to seep into our bones. We were both exhausted and scared. Then we saw it. A cave hidden behind a curtain of vines. The rustling sound was coming from inside. "Should we go in?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. I hesitated. I didn't like the look of this place. It felt wrong, but we couldn't just leave it unexplored. We had to find Kyle. "Yeah," I said, taking a deep breath. "Let's go." We pushed aside the vines and entered the cave. The air inside the cave was thick and heavy, like a wet blanket. It smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like blood. I shivered, and it wasn't just from the cold. Mark was right behind me, his flashlight beam dancing nervously around the cave walls. "Man, this place gives me the creeps," he muttered. "Tell me about it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The cave was narrow, the walls closing in on us like a vice. We had to duck under low-hanging rocks and squeeze through tight passages. The ground was uneven and treacherous, and I stumbled more than once. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water echoing through the cavern. We moved deeper into the cave, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. I kept expecting to see Kyle, huddled in a corner, injured but alive. But there was nothing. Just the endless, oppressive darkness. Then, I saw something glint in the beam of my flashlight. I bent down and picked it up. It was a flashlight, a small one, the kind a hiker might carry. It was dented and scratched, and the lens was cracked. "Looks like Kyle's," I said, my heart pounding. Mark nodded grimly. "Yeah, but where is he?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to think about the possibilities. We kept moving, our flashlights scanning the cave walls. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the cave. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, and it was covered in something dark that I didn't want to identify. "Mark, look," I whispered, pointing. He shone his flashlight at the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, silent and menacing. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered back, his voice shaking. I didn't know. I'd never seen anything like it before. It was like something out of a nightmare. And then, the figure turned its head. It had no face. Just a smooth, blank expanse of skin. I gasped and stumbled back, my foot catching on a rock. I fell to the ground, my flashlight clattering away. I scrambled back, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark was frozen, his flashlight beam fixed on the faceless figure. "We gotta get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse. Mark didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the cave walls. I scrambled to my feet and followed him, my own flashlight lost in the darkness. We didn't stop running until we were out of the cave and back in the pouring rain. We didn't even slow down until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the lock. Finally, I got the door open and we both piled in, gasping for breath. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal. We sped away from the trailhead, the tires spitting gravel and mud. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the figure was following us. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. That faceless horror in the cave. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Was it real? Was I going crazy? Dawn broke, and the storm had passed. The sky was a clear, crisp blue, the air fresh and clean. It felt like a cruel joke. How could the world look so normal after what I'd seen? I called my supervisor, a grizzled old veteran named John, and told him everything. He listened patiently, then said, "All right, son, I'm sending a team out there. You stay put." I wanted to argue, to insist on going back, but I knew he was right. I was in no shape to be searching for anything, let alone a faceless monster in a cave. A few hours later, John called me back. "We searched the whole cave," he said, his voice grave. Found nothing. No sign of Kyle, no sign of whatever you saw. Part of me was relieved. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the stress and the exhaustion had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew what I'd seen. There's one more thing, John said, his voice low. We found this. He sent me a picture. It was a handprint, small and bloody, on the cave wall. It looked like a child's handprint. But it wasn't. It was too elongated. The fingers were too long, too thin. My blood ran cold. It was real. That thing was real. I spent the next few days in a daze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, waiting for me. I jumped at every shadow, every creak in the floorboards. I couldn't eat. I could barely sleep. John kept me updated on the search for Kyle. They found a few more clues, a torn piece of clothing, a footprint, but nothing concrete. The trail was going cold. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around and wait for that thing to come back. I had to find Kyle. I had to stop it. The search for Kyle dragged on. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of him. The official search was called off after a while. They said it was presumed lost, likely fallen into a ravine or something. But I couldn't give up. I kept going back to that area, hiking the trails, searching the woods, hoping for any sign, any clue. I felt obsessed. Haunted. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was responsible for Kyle's disappearance. If I hadn't led Mark into that cave, if we hadn't seen that thing. One evening, I was sitting in my car at the trailhead, staring out at the darkening woods, when a truck pulled up beside me. An old beat-up pickup, with a faded NRA sticker on the back window. An old guy with a weathered face and a bushy beard got out. He looked like he'd spent his whole life in these mountains. He ambled over to my car and leaned against the window. "You that fella been snooping around here?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded warily. "Yeah, I'm looking for a missing hiker." The old guy squinted at me. "Named Kyle?" My heart leaped. "Yes." "You know something?" He took a long drag from his cigarette. "Might. Saw something a couple weeks back. Figured it weren't none of my business." "Please, sir, anything you saw could help," I pleaded. He hesitated, then said, "Saw a fella matching that description being dragged into the woods. Big fella doing the dragging. Tall, skinny. Kinda unnatural-like." My blood ran cold. It was the figure from the cave. No doubt about it. "Did you see where they went?" I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head. "Nah, it was getting dark. Just saw him disappear into the trees. Figured it was some kind of domestic dispute, best left alone." He flicked his cigarette butt to the ground and crushed it with his boot. "You be careful out there, son. These woods ain't what they used to be." With that, he got back in his truck and drove away, leaving me with a renewed sense of dread and a burning determination to find that creature and make it pay for what it had done. The old man's words echoed in my head. These woods ain't what they used to be. He was damn right. I couldn't shake the image of Kyle being dragged off by that thing. I had to do something, but what? An idea started to form in my mind, a dangerous, maybe stupid idea. I was going to hunt it. I knew the general area where the old-timer had seen Kyle disappear. It was a dense, overgrown section of forest, full of ravines and fallen trees. Perfect hiding spot for something that didn't want to be found. I spent the next few days preparing. I bought some new gear, a heavy-duty flashlight, a hunting knife, a can of bear mace. I even bought a cheap trail camera, hoping to get a picture of the creature. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to try something. When the night came, I drove to the trailhead and parked my car in a secluded spot. I checked my gear one last time, took a deep breath, and stepped into the woods. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, making the forest even darker than usual. I could hear the wind rustling through the leaves, the owls hooting in the distance. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. I felt like I was being watched, hunted. I set up the trail camera near a game trail, hoping the creature would use it as a path. Then I found a spot to hide, a thicket of bushes that offered some concealment. I settled in, my back against a tree trunk, my knife clutched in my hand. The hours crawled by. The cold seeped into my bones, and my muscles started to cramp. I was about to give up and head back to the car when I heard a sound. A soft, shuffling sound coming from the direction of the game trail. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sound. The shuffling got closer, and then I saw it. The figure. It emerged from the trees, its tall, thin form silhouetted against the dark sky. It was even more terrifying than I remembered. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its limbs long and spindly. It moved with an unnatural grace, like a spider on a web. And then it turned its head, and I saw it. That blank, faceless horror. I gasped, and the creature froze. It turned its head towards me, its invisible eyes seeming to pierce through the darkness. I fumbled for the bare mace, my fingers trembling. I aimed it at the creature and pressed the button. Nothing happened. The canister was empty. Panic seized me. I scrambled backwards, tripping over roots and branches, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature moved with an unnatural speed, its long limbs carrying it across the uneven ground with ease. I turned to run, but it was too late. It lunged, its long, bony fingers wrapping around my arm. I cried out in pain as it dragged me through the undergrowth, thorns and branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I struggled, kicking and screaming, but it was no use. It was too strong. I caught glimpses of its face, or lack thereof, as it dragged me along. That smooth, blank expanse of skin, those empty sockets where its eyes should have been. It was a nightmare come to life. Finally, it stopped, throwing me to the ground. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body throbbing with pain. I looked up and saw that I was in a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a dilapidated cabin, its windows boarded up, its door hanging by a single hinge. The creature dragged me towards the cabin, its grip like iron. It hauled me inside, the stench of decay and damp earth filling my nostrils. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I could make out the shapes of furniture, a table, a chair, a bed, all covered in dust and cobwebs. The creature threw me onto the floor, then slammed the door shut. I heard the sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place. I was trapped. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The creature was standing in front of me, its form barely visible in the gloom. It was holding something in its hand. A knife. The moonlight glinted off the blade, and I felt a surge of terror. I was going to die here, in this dark, forgotten cabin, at the hands of this thing. The creature moved closer, its footsteps silent on the dirt floor. I backed away, my hands outstretched, until I bumped into a wall. I was cornered. It raised a knife, the blade glinting in the moonlight. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But the blow never came. I opened my eyes and saw the creature standing there, the knife still raised. But it wasn't looking at me. It was looking at something behind me. I turned my head and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadows. He was holding the lantern, the light casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The creature lowered the knife and turned to face the man. The two of them stood there, facing each other, their forms illuminated by the flickering lantern light. I didn't know who the man was, but I knew one thing: he was my only hope. The man in the doorway didn't move. He just stood there, the lantern light flickering across his face, casting deep shadows that made it impossible to see his features clearly. The creature seemed to shrink back, its long limbs twitching nervously. "Leave him," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. The creature hesitated, then let out a low growl. It took a step back, its eyes, or the empty sockets where its eyes should have been, fixed on the man. I said, "Leave him," the man repeated, his voice firmer this time. The creature let out another growl, then turned and vanished into the darkness. I heard the sound of its footsteps retreating into the depths of the cabin. The man stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He turned and bolted it, then turned to face me. He raised the lantern, and the light fell on his face. He was old, his face weathered and wrinkled, his hair long and white. He had a long, white beard that reached down to his chest. His eyes were deep-set and dark, and they seemed to bore into me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The old man didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes unblinking. "What is that thing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man's lips moved, but no sound came out. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. He opened it and showed it to me. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams. I didn't recognize any of them. The old man pointed to one of the symbols. It was a circle with a dot in the center. "He is called the Hollow Man," the old man said, his voice raspy and weak. "He is a creature of darkness. He feeds on fear." I stared at the symbol, my mind reeling. The Hollow Man. It was a fitting name for that faceless horror. Why did he take me? I asked. The old man shrugged. "He is drawn to fear. You were afraid." I thought about the old man's words. He was right. I had been terrified. I was still terrified. "How did you stop him?" I asked. The old man pointed to the book. "This book contains the knowledge to control him." I looked at the book, my curiosity piqued. "What is it?" "It is an ancient book," the old man said. "It has been passed down through my family for generations." "What does it say?" I asked. The old man smiled. "It says many things. Things that you are not ready to know." He closed the book and put it back in his pocket. "You should go now," he said. "He will be back." I hesitated. "What about you?" The old man smiled again. "I will be fine. I am not afraid of him." He opened the door and gestured for me to leave. I stepped out of the cabin and into the night. The old man closed the door behind me, and I heard the bolt slide into place. I turned and walked away, my mind filled with questions. Who was that old man? What was that book? And what was the Hollow Man? I didn't know the answers to those questions, but I knew one thing: I would never forget this night. I stumbled through the woods, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The old man's words echoed in my head. He will be back. I had to get out of there, but where could I go? As I emerged from the trees, I saw a light in the distance. A single, flickering light, like a beacon in the darkness. I headed towards it, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. As I got closer, I saw that the light was coming from a campfire. There were two figures sitting around the fire, their faces obscured by the shadows. I approached cautiously, my hand hovering over the hunting knife at my belt. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse. The figures turned to face me. One of them was the old man from the cabin. The other was Kyle. Relief washed over me. He was alive. Kyle. I shouted, rushing towards him. He looked up at me, his face pale and drawn. He was thinner than I remembered, and his eyes were filled with fear. "What happened to you?" I asked, kneeling beside him. He shook his head, his lips trembling. He couldn't speak. The old man spoke up, his voice low and soothing. "He has been through a lot. He needs rest." I helped Kyle to his feet, and we walked over to the fire. I sat down beside him, my arm around his shoulders. He leaned against me, his body trembling. "It's okay," I said, trying to comfort him. "You're safe now." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. I smiled. "You're welcome." We sat there in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire. I looked at Kyle, his face still pale and drawn. He had been through a lot, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. Then, I noticed something. There were marks on his arms. Long, thin marks, like scratches. They were the same kind of marks I had seen on the walls of the cave. I looked at the old man, my heart pounding. What happened to him? I asked, my voice trembling. The old man looked at me, his eyes filled with sadness. The hollow man, he said. He feeds on fear. But he also takes. He reached out and touched one of the marks on Kyle's arm. He takes memories, he said. He takes pieces of the soul. I stared at Kyle, my mind reeling. The hollow man hadn't just tortured him. It had taken something from him. Something precious. I looked at the old man, my eyes filled with fear. What will happen to him? I asked. The old man shrugged. I don't know. But I fear he will never be the same. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the trees around us. But the warmth of the flames couldn't penetrate the chilling dread that had settled over me. Kyle sat beside me, staring blankly into the fire, his face a mask of emptiness. He hadn't spoken another word, hadn't even looked at me since that whispered thank you. The old man sat opposite us, his gaze fixed on the flames, his face etched with worry. Every so often, he'd glance at Kyle, a deep frown creasing his brow. What will happen to him? I asked again, the question a knot in my throat. The old man sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. The hollow man takes pieces of the soul, fragments of memory, of who we are. It leaves emptiness in their place. He looked at Kyle, his eyes filled with pity. Sometimes those pieces return. Sometimes they don't. I looked at Kyle, my heart aching. He was like a shell, a hollow echo of the man he had been. The vibrant, adventurous hiker was gone, replaced by this. The night wore on, the fire slowly dying down to embers. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the flames and the occasional hoot of an owl. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hollow man, its faceless horror burned into my mind. I kept glancing at Kyle, watching for any sign of recognition, any spark of his former self. But there was nothing. Just that blank, empty stare. As dawn approached, the old man stirred. He stood up, his joints popping, and threw some more wood on the fire. The flames leaped up, casting a warm glow on our faces. We should go, he said, his voice rough with sleep. It's not safe to stay here. I nodded, my stomach churning with anxiety. I helped Kyle to his feet, his body stiff and unresponsive. He moved like a puppet, his limbs jerky and uncoordinated. We followed the old man through the woods, the rising sun casting long shadows on the forest floor. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see the hollow man emerge from the trees, its long, spindly limbs reaching for us. But it didn't appear. We walked for hours, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. Finally, we reached the edge of the woods. The old man stopped and turned to face us. "This is where we part ways," he said. "Take care of him." He looked at Kyle, his eyes filled with sadness. I hope he finds his way back." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I watched him go, my heart heavy with uncertainty. I looked at Kyle, his face still blank, his eyes still empty. What was going to happen to him? What was going to happen to me? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing: our lives would never be the same. I drove Kyle back to his apartment in the city. It was a small, cluttered place, filled with hiking gear and photos of mountain vistas. It felt like a tomb, a monument to the man he used to be. He sat on the edge of his bed, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't seem to recognize his own home. I tried to talk to him, to ask him how he was feeling, but he didn't respond. He just sat there, lost in his own silent world. I stayed with him for a few days, trying to help him get back on his feet. I cooked him meals, helped him shower, and even tried to get him to go for walks. But nothing seemed to help. He was like a ghost, drifting through life without purpose or direction. One day, I came back to his apartment to find him gone. There was a note on the table, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Gone to find the rest of me. Don't follow." My heart sank. I knew where he was going. He was going back to the woods, back to the Hollow Man. I grabbed my keys and rushed out of the apartment. I had to stop him. I had to save him. I drove back to the trailhead, my mind racing. I had to find him before it was too late. I searched the woods for hours, calling out his name, but there was no answer. The forest was silent, oppressive. I felt a growing sense of dread. As night fell, I stumbled upon the clearing where I had first encountered the Hollow Man. The cabin was still there, its windows boarded up, its door hanging by a single hinge. I approached cautiously, my hand hovering over the hunting knife at my belt. I could hear a sound coming from inside the cabin. A low, guttural sound, like a growl. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I could see two figures in the center of the room. One of them was Kyle. He was standing facing the other figure, his back to me. The other figure was the Hollow Man. It was holding Kyle by the throat, its long, bony fingers digging into his flesh. Kyle was struggling, his face contorted in pain. I raised my knife and charged. The Hollow Man turned to face me, its empty socket seeming to bore into my soul. I lunged, plunging the knife into its chest. The creature let out a deafening shriek, its body convulsing. It dropped Kyle to the floor and turned to face me, its long limbs flailing. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The Hollow Man staggered towards me, its body covered in blood. It reached out for me, its long, bony fingers grasping at the air. I turned and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I jumped in and sped away, the tires spitting gravel and mud. I didn't look back. I don't know what happened to Kyle. I don't know if he survived, but I know one thing, the Hollow Man is still out there, and it's waiting for me. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed above, casting long, skeletal shadows across the sterile white walls of the small rural hospital. I glanced at the clock, its red numbers glowing ominously in the darkness, 3:17 a.m. Another night shift at the County General Hospital, another night alone. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor from a distant room and the rustling of papers on my desk. The air was thick with the cloying scent of disinfectant, a smell I'd long grown accustomed to. I was in the middle of organizing blood samples, the vials clinking softly against the metal tray, when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet like a scalpel. Phlebotomy, Mark speaking, I answered, my voice raspy from disuse. A pause, then a voice, distorted and crackling like a bad radio signal, spoke on the other end. We need a blood draw in room 214, urgent. The voice sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded strained, almost inhuman, like something was wrong with the connection. Room 214? I repeated, checking the patient list. It was odd. I didn't have any record of a new admission. Yes, 214, the voice hissed, impatience creeping into its tone. Now! The line went dead. I stared at the receiver, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. Room 214 was in the old wing, a section of the hospital that had been closed off for years due to budget cuts. It was said to be in a state of disrepair, with faulty wiring and a leaky roof. Why would they put a patient there? I grabbed my blood draw kit, the metal tools clinking against each other, and headed down the dimly lit corridor. The further I walked, the colder it seemed to get, a damp chill that seeped into my bones. The silence was heavier here, broken only by the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. As I approached the old wing, a sense of dread washed over me. The air grew thick with a strange, metallic scent, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. What was waiting for me in room 214? I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. Dust motes danced in the stale air, illuminated by the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. The smell hit me first, a strange, cloying sweetness mixed with the metallic tang of blood. It was nauseating, clinging to the back of my throat. The hallway stretched out before me, seemingly endless, lined with closed doors that looked like gaping mouths in the shadows. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the distance. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. Room 214 was at the very end of the hall. As I approached, I could hear a faint wheezing sound coming from within, like a pair of bellows struggling to pump air. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I had to lean against the wall for support. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed in the center. A figure lay beneath the thin white sheets, their form barely visible in the dim light. The wheezing sound was louder now, accompanied by a low, guttural moan. I approached the bed cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I could see the patient's face. It was pale and gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Their lips were pulled back in a grimace, revealing a set of yellow teeth. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. "I'm here to draw some blood." The patient didn't respond. They just lay there, their chests rising and falling with each shallow breath. I noticed that their skin was an unnatural shade of gray, almost like clay. I reached for my blood draw kit, my hand shaking. As I did, the patient's eyes flickered open. They were a deep, unsettling shade of red, like pools of blood. A wave of fear washed over me. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The patient's red eyes locked onto mine, and a wave of nausea surged through me. Those eyes weren't human, they were filled with something ancient and malevolent. I felt a primal urge to flee, to turn and run as fast as I could, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. The wheezing sound coming from the patient intensified, morphing into a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. The sweet, metallic scent grew stronger, making my eyes water. I fumbled with my blood draw kit, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "Sir, I need you to stay still," I managed to say, my voice a mere whisper. "This will only take a moment." The patient's lips curled into a sneer, revealing a set of teeth that seemed too sharp, too long. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that threatened to consume me. I found a suitable vein on the patient's arm, the skin beneath my fingers cold and clammy. As I inserted the needle, I felt a resistance, a strange elasticity that shouldn't have been there. I pushed harder, and a thick, black fluid oozed into the syringe. It wasn't blood. It was something else entirely, something viscous and dark, like tar. The stench was overpowering, a mix of rot and decay that made my stomach churn. I quickly withdrew the needle, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The patient's growl intensified, morphing into a high-pitched shriek that echoed through the room. Their body began to convulse violently, the thin sheet rising and falling with each spasm. I stumbled back, my eyes wide with horror. Something was happening, something terrifying. The patient's form was shifting, their bones cracking and snapping beneath their skin. Their limbs contorted at unnatural angles, and their fingers elongated into sharp claws. I had to get out of there. Panic seized me. I stumbled back, knocking over the floor stand with a loud crash. The metal pole clattered to the floor, the sound amplified in the eerie silence of the room. The patient, if you could even call it that anymore, thrashed on the bed, its limbs contorting at impossible angles. Its skin, once pale and gray, was now a sickly shade of green, stretched taut over bulging muscles. The bones beneath shifted and snapped, reforming into something grotesque and inhuman. Its jaw hung open, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, and its eyes burned with a malevolent red light. I scrambled away from the bed, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I had to get out of there, had to find help. But the door seemed miles away, and my legs felt like lead. The creature let out a guttural roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hospital. It lurched forward, its clawed hands reaching for me. I screamed, my voice raw with terror, and threw myself to the side just as its hand slammed into the wall where I had been standing. The creature pulled its hand back, leaving deep gouges in the plaster. It turned its head towards me, its eyes burning with a predatory hunger. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. There had to be a way out, something I could use to defend myself. But the room was bare, except for the bed and the overturned floor stand. I grabbed the metal pole, my knuckles white with fear. It was a feeble weapon, but it was all I had. The creature lunged again, its jaws snapping shut inches from my face. I swung the pole with all my might, striking it across the head. It let out a deafening screech, its body convulsing in pain. I took the opportunity to run, dodging its grasping claws. I reached the door, fumbling with the handle in my panic. It swung open, and I stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. I had escaped, for now. But I knew the creature wouldn't stay trapped in that room for long. I had to find help, had to warn the others. But who would believe me? Who would believe that the patient in room 214 was no longer human? I didn't stop running. The hallway stretched out before me, a seemingly endless tunnel of shadows and flickering lights. The smell of decay clung to me, a constant reminder of the horror I had just witnessed. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footsteps pounding on the linoleum floor. It was gaining on me, its raspy breaths echoing through the empty corridors. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw its silhouette, a grotesque mockery of a human form, illuminated by the dim emergency lights. Panic spurred me on. I had to find someone, anyone. But the hospital was eerily deserted. Where was everyone? Had they all fled? Or had they met the same fate as the patient in room 214? I reached the nurse's station, hoping to find a phone, a weapon, anything. But it was abandoned. Charts lay scattered on the floor, and a half-eaten cup of coffee sat cold on the desk. It was as if everyone had vanished into thin air. A wave of despair washed over me. I was alone, trapped in this nightmare with a creature that defied all reason. I slumped to the floor, my back against the desk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft scratching sound coming from the ventilation shaft above me. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature was crawling through the vents, its claws scraping against the metal. It was hunting me. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. I had to find a way out, a place to hide. But where? The creature was faster, stronger, and it knew the hospital better than I did. I spotted a door marked utility closet and lunged for it, throwing it open and slipping inside. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart pounding in my ears. The closet was small and cramped, filled with cleaning supplies and old medical equipment. I huddled in the corner, my breath held, listening for any sign of the creature. The scratching sound continued, moving along the vent above me. It was getting closer. I closed my eyes, praying that it wouldn't find me. The scratching sound stopped. I held my breath, listening intently. The silence was deafening. Had it gone? Or was it waiting for me to make a move? I peeked through a crack in the door. The hallway was empty. But I knew better than to think I was safe. The creature was cunning, and it could be lurking anywhere. I had to find a way to escape the hospital. But how? The doors were locked, and the windows were barred. I was trapped like a rat in a cage. Then I remembered the old service tunnels. They ran beneath the hospital, connecting the different wings. If I could find an access point, I might be able to make my way to the outside. I crept out of the closet, my movements slow and deliberate. I had to be careful not to make a sound. The creature could be anywhere, listening for the slightest noise. I found the access panel in the hallway, hidden behind a loose ceiling tile. I pried it open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a risky move, but it was my only chance. I squeezed through the opening, the dust and cobwebs clinging to my clothes. The air was thick and stale, and the only light came from the dim glow of the emergency lights in the hallway above. I followed the tunnel, my hands brushing against the cold, damp walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. After what seemed like an eternity, I saw a light at the end of the tunnel. I quickened my pace, my heart filled with hope. But as I got closer, I realized that the light wasn't coming from an exit. It was coming from another room, a room filled with medical equipment and supplies. And standing in the center of the room, its eyes glowing red in the darkness, was the creature. My blood ran cold. The creature stood bathed in the harsh fluorescent light, its grotesque form casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Its red eyes burned with a malevolent intensity, and its jaws hung open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a loose piece of concrete. I fell to the ground with a thud, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I scrambled back, my eyes frantically searching for an escape route. But there was none. The tunnel stretched out behind me, a dead end. The creature let out a guttural roar, the sound echoing through the confined space. It lunged forward, its clawed hands reaching for me. I screamed, my voice raw with terror, and rolled to the side just as its hands slammed into the ground where I had been lying. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to fight, had to defend myself. But how could I possibly fight something like that? I grabbed a metal pipe that lay discarded on the floor, my knuckles white with fear. It was a feeble weapon, but it was all I had. The creature lunged again, its jaws snapping shut inches from my face. I swung the pipe with all my might, striking it across the head. It let out a deafening screech, its body convulsing in pain. I took the opportunity to run, dodging its grasping claws. I sprinted down the tunnel, the creature's enraged roars echoing behind me. I had to find a way out, had to escape this nightmare. But the tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. I could hear the creature gaining on me, its footsteps pounding on the concrete floor. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw its silhouette, a grotesque mockery of a human form, illuminated by the dim emergency lights. Just as I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw a ladder leading up to a hatch in the ceiling. I scrambled up the rungs, my hands slipping on the cold metal. I reached the hatch and pushed it open, hauling myself into a dark, dusty room. I slammed the hatch shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had escaped, for now, but I knew the creature wouldn't give up so easily. It would find me. It was only a matter of time. I found myself in a small, windowless room, lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. It looked like some kind of storage room, filled with boxes of old medical supplies and discarded equipment. Dust lay thick on every surface, and the air was heavy with the smell of mildew. I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. I had escaped the creature, for now, but I was still trapped in this labyrinthine hospital. I had no idea where I was or how to get out. A wave of despair washed over me. I was alone, lost, and hunted. I sank to the floor, my head in my hands. I couldn't believe this was happening. It felt like a bad dream, a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. But the throbbing pain in my leg, where I had scraped it on the ladder, was a stark reminder that this was all too real. I had to pull myself together. I couldn't give up. I had to find a way out. I got to my feet, my legs shaky, and began to explore the room. Maybe there was another exit, a hidden door, or a window I could break. But my search yielded nothing. The room was a dead end. I slumped against a stack of boxes, my heart sinking. I was trapped. There was no escape. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft scratching sound coming from the ventilation shaft in the ceiling. I froze, my blood running cold. The creature had found me. I looked up, my eyes wide with fear. The vent cover was rattling, the screws slowly being unscrewed from the inside. I scrambled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The vent cover fell to the floor with a clang, and the creature's head emerged from the opening. Its red eyes burned with a malevolent intensity, and its jaws hung open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty room. The creature lunged forward, its clawed hands reaching for me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But the impact never came. Instead, I heard a sickening thud followed by a strangled gasp. I hesitantly opened my eyes to see the creature sprawled on the floor, its body twitching violently. A heavy metal toolbox lay overturned beside it, its contents scattered across the floor. Had it fallen? Had it somehow knocked the toolbox onto itself? I didn't know, and frankly, I didn't care. This was my chance. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had to get out of there, had to find a way to escape this nightmare. But the creature was blocking the only exit. I couldn't get past it without risking another confrontation. Then I noticed something. The creature's movements were becoming sluggish, its breath shallow and labored. The black fluid that had oozed from its veins was pooling on the floor, spreading like a dark stain. Was it dying? I didn't know what to make of it. Was this some kind of delayed reaction to the blood draw? Or was it something else entirely? I didn't have time to ponder the possibilities. I had to act. I grabbed a scalpel from the scattered toolbox, my hand shaking. It was a desperate gamble, but I had to try. I crept towards the creature, my heart pounding in my chest. It was still alive, its red eyes flickering weakly. I raised the scalpel, my hand trembling. I had never hurt anyone in my life, but this was different. This was survival. I plunged the scalpel into the creature's chest, aiming for its heart. It let out a final, ear-splitting screech, its body convulsing violently. Then it went still. I stood there for a moment, my breath catching in my throat, the scalpel still clutched in my hand. I had done it. I had killed the creature. But the relief was short-lived. I was still trapped in this hospital, alone and terrified. And I had no idea what other horrors might be lurking in the shadows. I stumbled out of the storage room, my legs weak and trembling. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to get out of that hospital. I wandered through the deserted corridors, the silence broken only by the echo of my own footsteps. The hospital seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of empty rooms and darkened hallways. I passed operating theaters with rusting instruments, abandoned nurseries with empty cribs, and morgues with steel tables stained with something that looked suspiciously like that black fluid. Each room held a silent terror, a chilling reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. As I walked, I noticed a strange change in the atmosphere. The air seemed lighter, cleaner. The oppressive sense of dread that had weighed me down for hours was beginning to lift. I glanced out a window and saw the first hint of dawn breaking over the horizon. The sky was a pale shade of gray, tinged with streaks of pink and orange. It was a beautiful sight, a stark contrast to the darkness and horror I had endured throughout the night. I found myself drawn to the light, to the promise of a new day. I stumbled towards the exit, my heart filled with a fragile hope. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The world outside seemed fresh and vibrant, reborn after the darkness of the night. I took a deep breath, savoring the clean, fresh air. But even as I stood there, basking in the light of the new day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hospital loomed behind me, a silent monolith against the brightening sky. And I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors might be lurking within its walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting victim. I turned and walked away, leaving the hospital behind me. But I knew I would never forget the horrors I had witnessed that night. And I knew that a part of me would always be haunted by the creature in room 214. As I walked, I glanced back over my shoulder one last time. And I saw a figure standing at the window of the old wing, its red eyes watching me. I'm not the kind of guy who usually goes camping. I prefer my creature comforts, you know? A soft bed, a warm shower, a reliable Wi-Fi connection. But my friends, well, they're the outdoorsy type. Every year, they drag me along on some adventure, and this year, it was a camping trip to the middle of nowhere. There's Liam, the leader of the pack, always enthusiastic and ridiculously optimistic. Then there's Sarah, the practical one, always prepared for every situation with a backpack full of first aid supplies and bug spray. And finally, there's Emily and Ben, the couple, always glued to each other's side and whispering sweet nothings. Me? I'm just Mark, the reluctant tag-along. We've been planning this trip for weeks, poring over maps, checking the weather forecast obsessively, and packing enough gear to survive a zombie apocalypse. The destination was Blackwood Forest, a remote and supposedly haunted patch of wilderness miles from civilization. Liam, of course, was thrilled about the haunted part. Me, not so much. The drive was long and uneventful, the kind where you end up singing along to cheesy pop songs just to stay awake. As we got deeper into the forest, the sunlight started to fade, and the trees grew taller and denser, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Even with 4 other people in the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. By the time we reached the campsite, it was almost dark. We scrambled to set up our tents, the urgency fueled by the encroaching darkness and the growing chorus of animal sounds from the surrounding woods. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth, and a chill wind whispered through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. As we huddled around the campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows on our faces, I tried to push down the growing sense of unease. Liam was already telling stories about the legendary Blackwood beast, a creature said to roam the forest, preying on unsuspecting campers. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help but glance nervously into the darkness beyond the firelight. We were laughing at one of Sarah's terrible jokes when I noticed it. I did a quick head count, my eyes darting from one face to the next, illuminated by the fire. Liam, Sarah, Emily, Ben, and one more. 6 shadows. 6 figures sitting around the campfire. "Hey," I said, my voice a little shaky, "how many of us are there?" They all looked at me like I was crazy. 5, obviously, Liam said, grinning. "Unless you've suddenly developed the ability to multiply." I stared at the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I told myself. Or maybe I was just tired and imagining things. But deep down, a cold, unsettling feeling was starting to take root. There was something wrong. Something very wrong. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up into the inky blackness above us. We roasted marshmallows, the sugary sweetness failing to comfort the growing unease in my gut. Liam, ever the oblivious one, was in his element, regaling us with spooky campfire stories, each one more outlandish than the last. I tried to laugh along, to act like I wasn't completely freaked out, but the image of that 6th shadow kept flashing in my mind. Sarah, bless her practical soul, tried to rationalize it. It was probably just the way the firelight was playing on the trees, she said, her voice a little too bright. Or maybe one of us was moving and created an extra shadow. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the feeling that something was off just wouldn't go away. It was like a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a constant awareness that we weren't alone. We finally settled down for the night, crawling into our tents and zipping ourselves in. The woods were alive with the sounds of crickets chirping, owls hooting, and the occasional rustle of leaves that made me jump. I lay there, staring up at the thin nylon of the tent, listening to the rhythmic breathing of Ben and Emily in the tent next to mine. Every time I was about to drift off, a twig would snap, or I hear a noise that sounded like footsteps just outside my tent. I'd hold my breath, straining to hear, but the sound wouldn't repeat. My imagination was working overtime, conjuring up images of shadowy figures lurking just beyond the firelight. I must have finally fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, the sun was streaming through the tent, and Liam was yelling about bacon and coffee. I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and stiff, to find the others already gathered around the fire, looking surprisingly cheerful. "Morning, sleepyhead," Emily chirped. "You missed the sunrise. It was spectacular." I forced a smile, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread from the night before. Maybe it was just a bad dream, I thought. Maybe I was letting Liam's spooky stories get to me. But as I sat down by the fire, I couldn't help but notice that there were 6 mugs laid out. 6 plates. 6 sets of cutlery. "Ah, Liam," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Why are there 6 places set?" He looked at me, confused. "Because there are 6 of us, dude." My blood ran cold. "No, there aren't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There are only 5. The silence that followed my question was deafening. Everyone stared at me, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. Liam, ever the joker, tried to lighten the mood. "Dude, are you messing with us? You know there are 5 of us, right?" He chuckled nervously, but his eyes darted around the campsite, as if looking for confirmation. "I'm not messing with you," I insisted, my voice rising in panic. "There are 6 mugs, 6 plates, 6. My voice trailed off as I noticed something else. Next to the fire pit, where we dumped our shoes the night before, there were 6 pairs of boots. 6. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't my imagination playing tricks on me. There was something else here with us. Something unseen. We spent the next hour frantically searching the campsite and the surrounding woods. We called out, looking for any sign of another person, but there was nothing. No one. "Maybe it's some kind of prank," Emily suggested, her voice trembling. "Maybe someone followed us from town and is messing with us. But who would do that? And how could they have set the extra place setting without us noticing?" The questions swirled in my head, unanswered and unsettling. We decided to try and salvage the day, hoping that whatever was happening was just a weird anomaly. We packed up our gear and set off on a hike, sticking to the marked trails, our eyes constantly scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The forest was beautiful, I'll give it that. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of leaves, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, and the air was fresh and crisp. But the beauty couldn't mask the underlying tension that hung over us like a shroud. We were about halfway through the hike when I noticed something strange. In the soft earth of the trail, there was a set of footprints. Not human footprints, though. These were smaller, more delicate, almost like a child's. I pointed them out to the others, and a wave of fear washed over their faces. We followed the tracks for a while, but they eventually disappeared into the undergrowth. "This is freaking me out," Sarah whispered, her eyes white with fear. "We need to get out of here." We agreed and turned back, our pace quickening as the feeling of being watched intensified. Back at the campsite, we found that things had been moved. Liam's backpack was lying open, its contents scattered on the ground. Emily's water bottle was missing. The sense of dread was growing with every passing minute. We were no longer just visitors in this forest. We were intruders, trespassers in someone else's domain. And whoever or whatever was watching us was making it very clear that we weren't welcome. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, ominous shadows across the campsite. The cheerful chirping of birds had been replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of my own heart. We were on edge, every nerve on high alert, waiting for the next strange occurrence. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "This isn't normal. This isn't safe." We all agreed, but the question was, where could we go? It was getting dark, and we were miles from civilization. The thought of wandering through the woods in the pitch black was terrifying. Liam, trying to maintain some semblance of control, suggested we take a group photo at the nearby scenic overlook. "Just to capture the, beauty of the place," he said, his voice betraying his own apprehension. We reluctantly agreed, hoping that maybe, just maybe, a group photo would somehow prove that we were just 5 friends, alone in the wilderness, and that all the strange happenings were just our overactive imaginations. We huddled together at the overlook, the setting sun casting a warm glow on our faces, a stark contrast to the growing darkness in the forest behind us. Emily held out her phone, her hand shaking slightly, and snapped a few pictures. Back at the campsite, as we huddled around the fire, Emily scrolled through the photos. We laughed at a few blurry shots, cringed at our awkward poses, and then she froze. "Oh my God," she whispered, her eyes white with horror. We crowded around her, peering at the phone screen. The photo showed the 5 of us, smiling awkwardly at the camera, the setting sun painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple. But behind us, in the shadows of the trees, stood a figure. It wasn't clear, just a dark silhouette, almost blending into the background. But it was definitely there. A tall, slender figure, with what looked like long, flowing hair. And it wasn't any of us. We stared at the photo in stunned silence. There was no way any of us could have been standing there. We would have seen them. We would have felt their presence. It's a glitch," Ben stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "A trick of the light." But deep down, we all knew it wasn't. This wasn't a smudge on the lens or a weird shadow. This was something else. Something real. Something that had been watching us all along. The photo was undeniable proof that we weren't alone. And the realization sent a wave of terror through the group, a terror that chilled us to the bone and left us paralyzed with fear. The photo hung in the air between us, a tangible representation of our growing fear. We passed Emily's phone around, each of us staring at the image, searching for a logical explanation, a trick of the light, anything to dismiss the chilling reality it presented. But there was no denying it. We weren't alone. Liam, normally the bravest of the bunch, was pale and trembling. Sarah, ever practical, was trying to keep it together, but her voice shook as she spoke. "Okay, we need to stay calm," she said, her eyes darting between us. "There has to be a rational explanation for this." But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. We all knew, deep down, that there was nothing rational about what was happening. Ben, usually the quiet one, suddenly slammed his fist on the picnic table, making us all jump. "This is bullshit," he shouted, his face red with anger. "I'm not going to let some creepy photo scare us. I'm going to find out who's messing with us." Before any of us could stop him, he stormed off into the woods, a flashlight clutched in his hand. "Ben, wait," Emily cried, running after him. "It's not safe." Liam and I exchanged a worried glance and followed them, Sarah close behind. We stumbled through the undergrowth, calling out Ben's name, our voices swallowed by the dense foliage. The forest was dark, the moonlight barely penetrating the thick canopy of leaves. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sounds were our own ragged breathing and the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. We searched for what felt like hours, but there was no sign of Ben or Emily. The fear that had been simmering within me boiled over into full-blown panic. We were lost, alone in the dark, and something was watching us. Finally, we stumbled back to the campsite, exhausted and terrified. Ben and Emily were sitting by the fire, their faces pale and drawn. "We couldn't find anything," Ben said, his voice hollow. "There's no one out there." But even as he said it, I knew he didn't believe it. We all felt it, the presence lurking just beyond our sight, watching us, toying with us. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen, to convince ourselves that there was a logical explanation. "Maybe it was a hiker," we said, "someone who had stumbled upon our campsite and decided to play a prank on us. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence, a series of unfortunate events that had conspired to make us feel like we were being watched." But the fear lingered, a heavy weight on our chests. We knew, deep down, that something was terribly wrong. And as the night deepened and the shadows lengthened, the feeling of dread grew stronger, suffocating us with its icy grip. Nightfall descended, draping the forest in an impenetrable darkness that seemed to press in on us from all sides. The campfire, our only source of light and warmth, flickered feebly, casting dancing shadows that stretched and distorted, playing tricks on our already frayed nerves. We huddled closer to the flames, each of us lost in our own terrified thoughts. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional whimper of fear that escaped one of us. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent our hearts racing and our eyes darting to the shadows, searching for the source of the sound. The feeling of isolation was suffocating. We were miles from civilization, cut off from the world, trapped in this nightmare with an unseen entity that seemed to be toying with us, feeding on our fear. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the flames, trying to find patterns in the dancing embers. But the image of the figure in the photo kept flashing in my mind, its shadowy form burned into my memory. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence. It was Emily. We all jumped up, our hearts pounding, adrenaline surging through our veins. Emily was sitting bolt upright in her tent, her eyes white with terror, her body trembling. "What is it?" Ben cried, rushing to her side. "What's wrong?" Someone touched me," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I felt it, a cold hand, on my face. We searched the tent frantically, but there was nothing there. No one. The realization that whatever was tormenting us could now reach into our tents, into our safe space, sent a fresh wave of terror through the group. We were no longer safe anywhere. As the night wore on, the fear intensified. We took turns keeping watch, our eyes constantly scanning the darkness, our ears straining for any sound that might betray the presence of our unseen tormentor. But the entity remained elusive, a phantom lurking just beyond our perception, its presence felt but never seen. It was a psychological torture, a slow and agonizing erosion of our sanity. I lay in my tent, unable to sleep, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. What did it want? Why was it tormenting us? Was it going to hurt us? The questions swirled in my head, unanswered and unsettling. I felt a cold dread creeping over me, a sense of impending doom that I couldn't shake off. And then, in the dead of night, I heard it. A whisper, soft as a breath, close to my ear. It said my name. My eyes flew open, my body rigid with fear. The whisper, my name, it was so close, so real. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sound, but there was only the silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. I lay there, paralyzed, my heart pounding in my chest, every nerve on high alert. Was it real? Was it my imagination? Or was it the entity, playing tricks on me, whispering my name in the dead of night? The fear was gnawing at me, eating away at my sanity. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to tell the others. I scrambled out of my tent, my legs shaking, and stumbled towards the campfire. The others were huddled around the dying embers, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering light. I heard it, I whispered, my voice trembling. It said my name. They looked at me, their eyes white with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Liam asked, his voice hoarse. The thing, the entity, it whispered my name, I repeated, my voice cracking. It was right next to me, in my tent. A wave of panic washed over the group. We were no longer dealing with strange occurrences and eerie shadows. This was something more sinister, something that knew us, something that was targeting us individually. The fragile trust that had held us together began to crumble. Suspicion crept in, poisoning our relationships. We started to question each other's motives, wondering if one of us was behind this, orchestrating this elaborate prank. But deep down, we all knew that this was beyond any human capability. This was something supernatural, something malevolent, something that was slowly but surely driving us mad. The argument started, fueled by fear and paranoia. We accused each other of hiding things, of not being completely honest. The sense of camaraderie that had brought us together on this trip was shattered, replaced by a suffocating atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. We were trapped in a nightmare, a descent into madness, and there was no escape. The entity was playing with us, pitting us against each other, watching with amusement as we tore ourselves apart. As the night wore on, the feeling of being hunted intensified. We were no longer just visitors in this forest. We were prey, trapped in a game of cat and mouse with an unseen predator. And as the first rays of dawn painted the horizon, we knew that we had to get out of there, or we would lose ourselves completely to the darkness that had consumed us. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves and twigs that littered the forest floor. They were getting closer, the sound growing louder, more menacing with every passing second. Panic surged through me, a cold wave of terror that threatened to overwhelm me. "Run!" I screamed, my voice raw with fear. We didn't hesitate. We turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth, our backpacks banging against our backs, our lungs burning with the effort. Branches whipped at our faces, thorns tore at our clothes, but we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. The footsteps followed us, relentless, gaining ground. We could hear the heavy breathing now, the rasping gasps of something inhuman, something monstrous. The feeling of being hunted, of being stalked by an unseen predator, was almost unbearable. We scrambled over fallen logs, our legs aching, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of trees and shadows, with no escape in sight. Liam, always the fastest, was in the lead, his face contorted with fear. Sarah was close behind, her eyes wide with panic. Emily and Ben were struggling to keep up, their faces pale and drawn. I glanced back over my shoulder, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence closing in on us, its malevolent intent palpable. Suddenly, Emily stumbled, her ankle twisting beneath her. She cried out in pain, falling to the ground. "Emily!" Ben shouted, rushing to her side. "We can't stop!" Liam yelled, his voice filled with desperation. "We have to keep going." But Ben wouldn't leave Emily. He knelt beside her, trying to help her up, his face etched with fear and concern. The footsteps were almost upon us now, heavy and menacing. We could hear the creature's ragged breathing, feel its hot breath on our necks. "Ben, we have to go!" I screamed, my voice cracking with fear. But it was too late. A dark shape emerged from the shadows, a towering figure that moved with unnatural speed. It lunged at Ben, its long, clawed hands reaching for him. Ben screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the forest. He tried to fight back, but he was no match for the creature's strength. We watched in horror as the creature dragged Ben into the shadows, his screams fading into the distance. "Ben!" Emily cried, her voice filled with anguish. But there was nothing we could do. We were helpless, powerless against the monstrous force that had taken our friend. We turned and ran, our hearts pounding with fear, our minds filled with the image of Ben's terrified face, his screams echoing in our ears. The chase was on again, and this time, we knew that there would be no escape. The forest blurred around us as we ran, our lungs burning, our legs screaming in protest. Every shadow seemed to hold the creature, every sound sent a fresh wave of terror through us. We were running on pure adrenaline, fueled by fear and the desperate hope of survival. Finally, through the trees, we saw it, the glint of moonlight on metal. The car. A surge of hope, fragile and fleeting, coursed through me. We could make it. We could escape this nightmare. We burst out of the treeline and scrambled towards the car, our hands fumbling with the keys, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Liam managed to unlock the doors, and we piled in, slamming the doors shut behind us. But as we turned to each other, our faces pale and streaked with tears, the realization hit us like a punch to the gut. Emily was missing. "Where's Emily?" Sarah cried, her voice filled with panic. We looked back at the dark forest, our hearts sinking. We had left her behind. Liam slammed his fist on the steering wheel, his face contorted with anguish. "We can't go back," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's too dangerous." We knew he was right, but the thought of leaving Emily behind, alone in the darkness with that creature, was unbearable. But we had no choice. Liam threw the car into gear, and we sped away, leaving the forest behind, leaving Emily behind. The tires spun on the gravel, spitting rocks as we tore down the narrow road, the headlights cutting through the darkness, our escape a desperate flight from the horrors we had witnessed. We didn't speak. There were no words to express the guilt, the fear, the overwhelming sense of loss that consumed us. We had survived, but at what cost? The drive back to civilization was a blur. We arrived at Liam's house, exhausted, traumatized, our clothes torn and dirty, our minds filled with the horrors we had endured. We sat in silence, the weight of our experience pressing down on us. What had we encountered in that forest? What was that creature? And what had happened to Emily? The questions haunted us, unanswered and unsettling. We had escaped the physical clutches of the forest, but the psychological scars remained, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of our reality. We had survived, but we were forever changed. The carefree days of laughter and adventure were gone, replaced by a deep-seated fear, a constant awareness of the fragility of life, and the lurking shadows that haunted our dreams. And as I lay in my own bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly alone. That something had followed us from the forest, something that was watching us, waiting for the opportune moment to strike again. The experience had left us with a profound sense of unease, a lingering fear that would forever haunt us. We had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. And in its depths, we had glimpsed a darkness that we could never unsee. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being alone in the woods, surrounded by nature, that just makes me feel at peace. So when I saw a trail I hadn't noticed before, I decided to explore it. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining. The birds were singing. I didn't have a worry in the world. About an hour in, I spotted something glinting in the sunlight. It was off the trail, nestled amongst the roots of an ancient oak tree. Curiosity piqued, I veered off the path to investigate. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was about the size of my palm and fit snugly in my hand. The wood was dark, almost black, and cool to the touch. It felt incredibly old, yet strangely pristine, with no signs of decay or damage. There were no hinges or latches, just a seamless lid that seemed fused to the base. I tried to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was like it was sealed shut. I shook it, and something rattled inside. It sounded like small, dry twigs or bones. A shiver ran down my spine. Why would anyone leave something like this out here? I should have left it there. I know I should have. But something about the box drew me in. I slipped it into my backpack and continued my hike, but the image of the box and the unsettling rattle stayed with me. By the time I got back to my car, the sun was starting to set. The woods were taking on an eerie quality in the fading light. I hurried to my car, eager to get home. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching out behind me. When I got home, I tossed my backpack onto the couch and headed to the kitchen to make dinner. But as I passed the living room, I noticed something strange. The box was sitting on the coffee table. I know I left it in my backpack. I distinctly remember zipping it up. How did it get out? I cautiously approached the table, my heart pounding in my chest. The box was open. The lid lay on the table beside it, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, dried, black rose. I stared at the black rose, its velvety petals seeming to absorb the dim light of my living room. It felt wrong, out of place. Like a dead thing in a living space. I carefully picked it up by the stem, its delicate petals surprisingly firm. It didn't crumble like I expected. It felt preserved. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled back onto the couch. I felt nauseous, my stomach churning. I chalked it up to the lingering adrenaline from my unsettling discovery and the weirdness of the box somehow transporting itself from my backpack to the coffee table. I placed the rose on a napkin and decided to deal with it later. Right now, all I wanted was a hot shower and some food. But as I walked towards the bathroom, I noticed something else. A faint scratching sound, like tiny claws on wood, coming from inside the walls. I froze, listening intently. The scratching continued, moving from one wall to another. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. I told myself it was probably just mice, but a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I'd never had mice before. The shower helped, somewhat. The hot water calmed my nerves, and for a while, I managed to push the unsettling events to the back of my mind. But as I lay in bed that night, the scratching returned. It seemed louder now, closer. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. It felt like the scratching was inside my head. Sleep didn't come easy. When I finally drifted off, I was plagued by vivid nightmares. I dreamt of shadowy figures lurking in the woods, their eyes glowing in the darkness. I dreamt of the black rose, its petals transforming into sharp thorns that pierced my skin. I woke up with a start, my heart racing. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I lay there, listening, but the scratching had stopped. Just as I was about to drift back to sleep, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the coffee table. From the box. I scrambled off the bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. I crept towards the coffee table, my eyes fixed on the box. The scratching was coming from inside, louder now, more frantic. It sounded like something was trying to claw its way out. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid. What if something was actually in there? Something that shouldn't be. But curiosity, or maybe a morbid sense of obligation, overcame my fear. I slowly lifted the lid. The box was empty. The scratching stopped. I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the warmth of the room. I must have imagined it, I told myself. It was just the wind, or maybe the owls settling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I closed the box and put it back on the coffee table. I couldn't bring myself to touch the rose. I just wanted to get as far away from it as possible. The next morning, I decided to get rid of the box. I wrapped it in a plastic bag, then wrapped it in newspaper, and finally stuffed it into a shoebox. I drove to the local park and tossed it into the deepest trash can I could find. Good riddance, I muttered to myself. I felt a sense of relief as I walked back to my car. Maybe that was the end of it. Maybe I could finally get some sleep. But as I turned the corner, I saw it. The box. Sitting on the hood of my car. The plastic bag was torn open, the newspaper shredded. The box itself was unscathed. I stared at it, my blood running cold. How was this possible? I cautiously approached the car, my eyes darting around, looking for an explanation. Was someone messing with me? But there was no one around. The park was deserted. I reached out and touched the box. It was cold, colder than it should have been. The scratching started again, faint at first, then growing louder. I snatched my hand back as if burned. I couldn't get rid of it. This thing, whatever it was, it wanted to be with me. I drove home in a daze, the box sitting on the passenger seat beside me. I couldn't stop glancing at it, half expecting it to disappear or do something else bizarre. But it just sat there, silent and ominous. Back in my apartment, I locked the box in a drawer, hoping to at least keep it out of sight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, even through the wood and metal. The scratching continued intermittently, a constant reminder of its presence. I needed answers. I started by scouring the internet, typing in every keyword I could think of: antique wooden box, black rose symbolism, haunted objects. I found nothing relevant, just a bunch of creepypastas and online forums filled with people claiming to have encountered similar things. None of them offered any concrete explanations or solutions. I even visited the local library, hoping to find some obscure folklore or mythology book that might shed light on the box's origins. The librarian, a kind old lady with a fondness for ghost stories, seemed intrigued by my description but couldn't offer any helpful leads. Days turned into weeks, and the situation only worsened. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every creak and shadow. I barely slept, haunted by nightmares of the black rose and the incessant scratching. My appetite vanished, and I lost a significant amount of weight. My friends started to notice, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. They think I was crazy. The isolation was suffocating. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, with no escape in sight. The box had become the center of my world, a constant source of fear and anxiety. I was starting to lose my grip on reality, questioning my own sanity. One evening, I found myself staring at the box again, its dark wood seeming to pulse with an eerie light. I reached out and touched it, a strange compulsion overriding my fear. The scratching intensified, and I felt a jolt of energy, like static electricity, course through my body. I jerked my hand back, my heart pounding. I knew then that this was beyond anything I could handle alone. I needed help, professional help. But who would believe me? Who could possibly understand? I decided to see a doctor. Not just any doctor, but a specialist, someone who dealt with unusual cases. I found Dr. Albright online, a psychiatrist with a reputation for taking on patients with unexplained symptoms and delusional beliefs. He seemed like my best shot. Dr. Albright listened patiently as I recounted my experiences, from the discovery of the box to the scratching sounds and the nightmares. He didn't scoff or dismiss me like I feared. Instead, he seemed genuinely intrigued. "This is quite a fascinating case," he said, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. "I've encountered patients with similar experiences, though the specifics are always unique." He ran some tests, physical and psychological, but everything came back normal. "There's nothing physically wrong with you," he concluded, "but your mental state is clearly under immense strain." I felt a surge of frustration. But the box, the rose, the scratching. I stammered, "It's all real." Dr. Albright nodded. "I believe you," he said calmly. "But the question is, what's causing these experiences? Is it an external force, or is it something originating within your own mind?" He suggested I try hypnosis to explore any repressed memories or subconscious anxieties that might be manifesting as these strange phenomena. I was skeptical, but desperate for any kind of explanation. The hypnosis sessions were intense. I felt like I was floating in a dark void, my mind filled with swirling images and fragmented memories. I saw glimpses of the woods, the box, the rose, but also other things I couldn't quite grasp. Faces, shadows, whispers. One session, in particular, stood out. I felt a cold dread wash over me, like I was being watched by something ancient and malevolent. I saw the black rose again, but this time it was alive, its petals writhing like tentacles. I felt a sharp pain in my arm, and when I looked down, I saw a circular rash forming, a perfect imprint of the rose. I woke up from the hypnosis in a panic, my heart racing. The rash was still there, red and inflamed. Dr. Albright seemed concerned but also excited. "This is significant," he said, examining the rash. "It seems your subconscious is manifesting physical symptoms. But the question remains, what triggered this?" I didn't have an answer. But I knew one thing, the box was changing me, and I was terrified of what I was becoming. The rash on my arm was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I started experiencing a whole host of physical symptoms. I was constantly tired, no matter how much I slept, My head throbbed with a dull ache that wouldn't go away. I had no appetite, and the little food I managed to force down made me nauseous. But the worst part was the insomnia. I'd lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with anxious thoughts. The scratching in the walls seemed to intensify at night, a constant reminder of the box's presence. Even when I did manage to drift off, I was plagued by vivid nightmares, filled with disturbing imagery and unsettling whispers. I tried everything I could think of to get some rest. Melatonin, sleeping pills, even meditation apps. Nothing worked. I was trapped in a perpetual state of exhaustion, my body and mind slowly breaking down. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I felt a strange tingling sensation all over my body, like I was being crawled on by invisible insects. I stumbled out of bed and into the bathroom, flicking on the light. I gasped when I saw my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot and sunken, my skin pale and clammy. But that wasn't the worst part. There, on my face, were faint, dark lines, like cracks in a porcelain doll. They spread across my forehead, down my cheeks, and around my eyes, forming a grotesque mask. I touched my face, tracing the lines with trembling fingers. They felt real, like raised welts beneath my skin. I scrubbed at them with soap and water, but they wouldn't come off. Panic surged through me. I was losing it. The box was changing me, physically and mentally, and I didn't know how to stop it. I stumbled back to my bedroom and collapsed on the bed, burying my face in the pillow. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to release the terror that was building inside me. But all I could do was lie there, my body trembling, as the scratching in the walls grew louder, closer, like something was trying to break through. The cracks on my face deepened, spreading like a spider web across my skin. They were no longer faint lines, they were fissures, deep grooves that seemed to pulse with a sickly light. Makeup couldn't conceal them, and even in the dimmest light, they were horrifyingly visible. I stopped going out. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone seeing me like this, a grotesque mockery of a human being. I called in sick to work, feigning a bad flu. My friends called and texted, concerned about my sudden disappearance, but I ignored them all. The isolation was complete. I was trapped in my apartment, a prisoner of my own fear and the box's insidious influence. The scratching in the walls was constant now, a maddening chorus that echoed through my sleepless nights. One day, while rummaging through a drawer, I stumbled upon an old photo album. I flipped through the pages, looking at pictures of myself from happier times, hiking in the woods, laughing with friends, celebrating birthdays. I barely recognized the person in those photos. The vibrant, carefree woman had been replaced by a hollow shell, haunted by fear and consumed by an unseen force. Tears welled up in my eyes. I missed my old life, my friends, my freedom. I missed being normal. A wave of anger washed over me. Anger at the box, at the rose, at whatever entity was tormenting me. I grabbed the box from the drawer and hurled it against the wall. It hit with a sickening thud, but didn't break. The scratching intensified, a furious response to my outburst. I picked up the box again, this time with a sense of determination. I was done being a victim. I would fight back, even if it was the last thing I did. I marched into the kitchen, grabbed a hammer from the toolbox, and returned to the living room. I placed the box on the floor and raised the hammer above my head. The scratching reached a fever pitch, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. But I held firm, my grip on the hammer tightening. With a guttural cry, I brought the hammer down on the box. The hammer connected with the box, and a shock wave of energy pulsed through my body. I stumbled backward, dropping the hammer with a clatter. The scratching abruptly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to amplify the pounding of my heart. I stared at the box, expecting it to be shattered, splintered into 1,000 pieces. But it was intact. Not a scratch, not a dent. It was as if my desperate attack had had no effect whatsoever. Disappointment and a renewed sense of dread washed over me. I had failed. The box was indestructible, just like the evil it contained. Suddenly, the box began to vibrate, a low hum emanating from within. The black rose inside seemed to writhe, its petals unfurling like a creature awakening from a long slumber. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the box, my breath catching in my throat. The air grew thick with a cloying sweetness, the scent of decay and something ancient, something wrong. Then, the lid of the box creaked open. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I could only watch in horror as a tendril of black smoke snaked out from the box, reaching towards me like a grasping hand. The smoke enveloped me, seeping into my pores, invading my senses. I choked on the putrid sweetness, my eyes stinging from the acrid fumes. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me dissolved into a swirling vortex of darkness. I felt myself falling, tumbling into an abyss of nothingness. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling. The smoke was gone, the box still and silent. But I was changed. I could feel it in every fiber of my being. I looked at my hands, expecting to see them withered, decayed, marked by the touch of the black smoke. But they looked normal. I touched my face, tracing the cracks that had marred my skin. They were gone. I was healed. But the relief was short-lived. A cold dread settled over me, a chilling certainty that this was not the end. The box had not been defeated. It had simply evolved. And I, its unwilling host, was now inextricably linked to its dark purpose. The following days were a blur. I went through the motions of my life, eating, sleeping, even venturing out to the grocery store, but it was all a facade. I felt detached, like an observer in my own body. The scratching in the walls had vanished, replaced by a pervasive silence that was somehow more unsettling. It was as if the box was no longer trying to get my attention, it simply was. A constant presence lurking in the shadows of my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the box had somehow lost its power. But deep down, I knew it was just biding its time, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Then, the dreams started. They weren't nightmares, not in the traditional sense. They were vivid, hyper-realistic visions, filled with cryptic symbols and disturbing imagery. I saw swirling galaxies, ancient ruins, and grotesque creatures that defied description. One recurring dream featured a vast, desolate landscape shrouded in an oppressive darkness. In the distance, a solitary figure beckoned me forward, its voice a whispering echo in the wind. I knew, instinctively, that this figure was connected to the box, to the entity that had invaded my life. It was calling me, drawing me towards an unknown fate. I tried to resist, to wake myself from these unsettling visions, but they grew stronger each night, their grip on my subconscious tightening. I felt myself being pulled towards the desolate landscape, towards the whispering figure, towards an abyss of darkness. One morning, I woke up with a start, my body drenched in sweat. The dream lingered, its images burned into my mind. I felt a strange compulsion to return to the woods, to the place where I had found the box. I knew it was a trap, a lure set by the entity to draw me deeper into its grasp. But I couldn't resist. I had to know, to understand what was happening to me. So, I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and headed out the door, driven by a force I couldn't comprehend. As I drove, the dreamlike visions intensified, the whispering voice growing louder, urging me onward. I was heading towards the unknown, towards a destiny that filled me with both dread and a strange sense of anticipation. The box had chosen its path, and I, its unwilling pawn, was powerless to resist. The woods were different this time. Darker, more oppressive. The air hung heavy with a suffocating humidity, and the usual sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves were replaced by an unsettling silence. I followed the familiar path, my heart pounding in my chest. The dreamlike visions intensified, the whispering voice guiding me deeper into the woods. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching myself from outside my body. As I approached the ancient oak tree where I had found the box, a wave of dizziness washed over me. I stumbled, my vision blurring, and collapsed onto the damp forest floor. When I opened my eyes, the world around me had transformed. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air throbbed with an unseen energy, and the ground beneath me pulsed with a faint, rhythmic beat. I saw the box nestled amongst the roots of the oak tree, its dark wood gleaming in the unnatural light. It was open, the black rose nestled inside, its petals now a deep crimson, almost blood-like. The whispering voice intensified, urging me closer. I crawled towards the box, my body trembling, my mind filled with a chaotic mix of fear and anticipation. As I reached out to touch the box, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and translucent, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It was the figure from my dreams, the one that had been beckoning me. The figure spoke, its voice a chilling whisper that seemed to resonate deep within my soul. It spoke of ancient powers, of forgotten rituals, of a destiny that awaited me. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt their meaning, their power. I was being drawn into something vast and ancient, something beyond human comprehension. The figure reached out its hand, its touch sending a jolt of energy through my body. I felt my consciousness slipping away, my sense of self dissolving into the darkness. Then, everything went black. I woke up with a gasp, my eyes snapping open. I was lying in my bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. It was all a dream. Just a dream. But as I sat up, I noticed something on my nightstand. A small, intricately carved wooden box. And inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, dried, black rose. I was 6 when it happened. 6 years old, and the world was this massive, magical place where trees talked and squirrels wore tiny hats. At least, that's how I saw it back then. Yosemite, with its towering redwoods and whispering waterfalls, was like stepping into a fairy tale. Until it wasn't. We were on a family camping trip. Mom, Dad, my older sister Sarah, and me, little Lily. It was supposed to be a week of adventure, bonding around campfires and roasting marshmallows. Instead, it became the week my childhood ended. I remember that day vividly. The crisp morning air, the smell of pine needles and damp earth, the excited chatter of my parents as we set off on the trail. Sarah, being 12 and too cool for everything, lagged behind, her nose stuck in a book. I, on the other hand, was bouncing off the trees, chasing butterflies with reckless abandon. Mom and Dad kept telling me to slow down, to stay close. But the woods were calling, beckoning me deeper with promises of hidden treasures and talking animals. I was too caught up in my own world to notice the worried glances my parents exchanged. Then it happened. One minute I was skipping ahead, the next I was surrounded by towering trees, the sounds of my family's voices swallowed by the thick foliage. I called out for them, my voice a tiny thread in the vast wilderness. But there was no reply. Panic clawed at my throat. I ran, blindly, desperately, branches whipping in my face, tears blurring my vision. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent shivers down my spine. I was lost. Alone. Hours seemed to crawl by. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The once enchanting woods transformed into a menacing labyrinth, filled with unseen eyes and lurking dangers. Finally, just as the last rays of sunlight faded, I heard voices. Not my family's, but rough, unfamiliar voices. Strong arms scooped me up, carrying me through the darkening woods. I remember the scratchy uniforms, the smell of stale coffee and cigarettes, the concerned faces of the park rangers. They asked me questions I couldn't answer, their words a jumbled mess in my terrified mind. All I could tell them was that I was lost, that my family was gone. The search for my family lasted for days, weeks even. Helicopters roared overhead, search parties combed the trails, their calls echoing through the desolate landscape. But they found nothing. No sign of my parents, no trace of Sarah. We went home, my grandparents and I, to a house filled with whispers and shadows. The laughter was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. My parents' faces, frozen in time on the mantelpiece, stared down at me with accusing eyes. It was my fault. I knew it. If I hadn't run off, if I had listened to them, they would still be here. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant weight on my small shoulders. And somewhere, deep down, a tiny flicker of hope remained. Maybe, just maybe, Sarah was still out there, lost but alive. Going back to that empty house was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. It wasn't home anymore. It was a shell, a hollow echo of laughter and warmth, now filled with the ghosts of memories I couldn't escape. Grandma and Grandpa tried their best. They really did. But their faces were etched with a grief so profound, it felt like it sucked all the oxygen out of the rooms. Their sadness was a heavy blanket, suffocating me with its weight. The police investigation dragged on, each unanswered question a fresh wound. They labeled it a possible abduction, but the lack of evidence, the sheer vastness of Yosemite, made it seem like chasing shadows. Eventually, the case went cold, another unsolved mystery buried beneath the weight of others. Mom and Dad, they were never the same. The spark in their eyes, the easy smiles they used to share, it was all gone. Replaced by a hollow ache, a constant reminder of what we'd lost. They moved like ghosts themselves, their voices hushed, their touch hesitant. Their arguments became a nightly ritual. The blame game, a vicious cycle of what-ifs and if-onlys. I'd lie awake in bed, listening to their muffled shouts, the crashing of plates, the gut-wrenching sobs that followed. One night, the fighting escalated. It was louder, more intense than usual. I crept out of bed, drawn by the fear and the morbid curiosity that only a child can possess. I peeked through the crack in the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest. Mom was standing by the window, her back to me, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Dad was pacing the room, his face contorted in anger and despair. "It's your fault," he yelled, his voice cracking. "If you hadn't insisted on that stupid camping trip." The words hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. Mom turned around, her eyes filled with a chilling rage I'd never seen before. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How dare you blame me for this?" The fight that followed was a blur of accusations, insults, and the shattering of a picture frame, the one with our family portrait, taken just days before the trip. The glass shards scattered across the floor, a reflection of our shattered family. That night, I made a decision. I packed a small bag with a few belongings and my favorite stuffed animal, a worn-out teddy bear named Mr. Grumbles. I slipped out of the house, the silence of the night swallowing my footsteps. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there any longer. The constant fighting, the suffocating grief, it was too much. I just wanted to escape, to find a place where the memories wouldn't haunt me. I ended up at the park, curled up on a bench beneath the old oak tree, Mr. Grumbles clutched tightly in my arms. The stars twinkled above me, indifferent to my pain. And as the first rays of dawn painted the sky, I knew one thing for sure: my life would never be the same. 15 years. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet the memories were as sharp as ever. They lurked in the shadows of my mind, waiting for a moment of weakness to creep in and consume me. I'd built a life for myself, as best as I could. Finished college, got a decent job in the city, miles away from the whispering pines of Yosemite and the ghosts of my past. But you can't outrun your demons, no matter how fast you run. It started with a text. Just 3 words, sent from an unknown number: "She's alive." My heart stuttered, a cold dread gripping me like a vice. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. Who sent this? How did they know? Was it some sick joke, some cruel prankster preying on my deepest fears? I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. The voice was robotic, generic, offering no clues. I reported it to the police, but they were as baffled as I was. With no leads and no further messages, the whole thing felt like a fever dream, a cruel trick of my anxious mind. But something shifted within me. A dormant hope, buried deep beneath layers of grief and guilt, flickered back to life. Could it be true? Could Sarah actually be alive after all these years? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. It opened up old wounds, brought back the pain and the unanswered questions that had haunted me for so long. But it also offered a glimmer of light in the darkness, a chance to finally find some closure, some semblance of peace. The nights that followed were restless. Sleep became a battlefield where fragmented memories clashed with vivid nightmares. I'd see Sarah's face, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with fear, calling out my name from the depths of a dark forest. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the echoes of her screams ringing in my ears. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But they grew louder, more insistent, seeping into my waking hours. I hear them in the quiet moments, in the dead of night, in the bustling crowds of the city. They seem to come from everywhere and nowhere, whispering my name, taunting me with cryptic messages, promising answers I desperately craved. I started seeing things too. Shadows moving in the periphery of my vision, fleeting glimpses of a figure lurking in the corner of my eye. A feeling of being watched, followed, haunted by something unseen. The rational part of me knew it was stress, anxiety, the reawakened trauma. But deep down, a primal fear took root. Something was wrong. Something had woken up in the woods of Yosemite, and it was reaching out to me. It happened on Wednesday, the most mundane of days. I was at work, staring blankly at my computer screen, pretending to be busy while my mind was a whirlwind of whispers and shadows. My phone rang, shattering the monotony of the office. It was Grandpa. "She's here," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. "Sarah. They found her." The words hit me like a thunderbolt. My breath caught in my throat, my hands turning clammy. What? Where? How? I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "They found her near the park entrance," Grandpa explained, his voice thick with emotion. She's alive. They're bringing her to the hospital now." I hung up the phone, my mind reeling. Sarah. Alive. After all these years. It felt surreal, impossible. Like a cruel trick, a twisted game my subconscious was playing on me. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out of the office, ignoring the confused stares of my colleagues. I hailed a cab, the urgency of the situation making me oblivious to the honking horns and the impatient drivers. All I could think about was Sarah. The hospital waiting room was a sterile, brightly lit space, filled with the hushed murmurs of worried families and the antiseptic smell that always clung to hospitals. Grandpa was there, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. He looked up as I entered, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and apprehension. "She's in with the doctors now," he said, his voice hoarse. "They're running some tests, making sure she's okay." We sat in silence, the weight of the years hanging heavy between us. The unanswered questions, the guilt, the lingering pain of our shattered family, it all came flooding back, threatening to drown me in its intensity. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor emerged from the examination room. He was a young man, with kind eyes and a weary smile. "She's physically healthy," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "A bit dehydrated and disoriented, but that's to be expected after everything she's been through." He hesitated, his gaze flickering between Grandpa and me. "There's something else you should know," he continued, his voice dropping to a hushed tone. "She has no memory of the past 15 years. It's like that part of her life has been completely erased." My heart sank. Amnesia. Another layer of mystery, another obstacle in our quest for answers. But at least she was alive. That was all that mattered. We were finally allowed to see her. She was lying in bed, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. She looked so fragile, so vulnerable. My heart ached for her, for the lost years, for the pain she must have endured. As I reached out to touch her hand, her eyes fluttered open. They were the same blue eyes, but something was different. The spark was gone, replaced by a vacant emptiness that sent shivers down my spine. "Sarah?" I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. She looked at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. Who are you?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My sister was back, but she was a stranger. Lost in the abyss of her own mind, a prisoner trapped in a past she couldn't remember. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and apprehension. Sarah's return was a miracle, a blessing, but it came with a heavy dose of unease. She was a stranger in a familiar body, her memories a fragmented puzzle with crucial pieces missing. The doctors called it dissociative amnesia, a coping mechanism triggered by trauma. They said it was common in cases like hers, where the mind blocks out painful memories to protect itself. But their explanations offered little comfort. The Sarah I knew, the one who used to tease me relentlessly and steal my favorite stuffed animals, was gone. She was quiet, withdrawn, her gaze often distant and unfocused. She'd spend hours staring out the window, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon, as if searching for something lost in the landscape of her own mind. There were other changes too, subtle at first, but increasingly disturbing. She developed an aversion to sunlight, wincing whenever we stepped outside. Her skin became pale, almost translucent, like moonlight filtering through thin ice. She moved with an unnatural grace, her limbs bending at impossible angles, her reflexes lightning fast. Her appetite was another cause for concern. She'd pick at her food, barely touching anything on her plate. But at night, I hear strange noises coming from the kitchen, the rustling of wrappers, the clinking of glasses. One morning, I found a half-eaten raw steak hidden in the back of the fridge, the sight of it making my stomach churn. Her sleep patterns were erratic. She'd toss and turn all night, mumbling incoherently in her sleep. Sometimes, I'd wake up to find her standing by my bed, her eyes wide open, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I crept into her room, armed with a flashlight and a pounding heart. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes closed. A thin stream of moonlight illuminated her face, casting eerie shadows that danced across her features. "Sarah?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Her eyes snapped open, their blue depths filled with an unnerving awareness. "I can hear you, you know," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. I just wanted to check on you," I stammered, feeling a chill run down my spine. She tilted her head, her gaze piercing through me. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not safe." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up, her movements fluid and silent. She walked towards the window, her gaze fixed on the moonlit woods beyond. "They're watching," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're always watching." A wave of fear washed over me. Who was she talking about? What was she seeing? I wanted to shake her, to demand answers, but something held me back. There was a darkness in her eyes, a chilling knowledge that went beyond the realm of human understanding. As I backed away from her room, I knew one thing for sure. My sister was back, but she wasn't the same. Something had changed her, something sinister and unknown. And I had a growing sense of dread that whatever happened to her in those woods was far from over. Sarah's amnesia was a brick wall, a frustrating dead end in my desperate search for answers. But I wasn't about to give up. I needed to understand what happened to her, what she'd endured during those missing years. And more importantly, I needed to know if there was any chance of finding Lily. My first stop was the police station. I dug up the old case files, poring over every detail, every witness statement, every dead-end lead. The reports painted a grim picture, a family vanished without a trace, swallowed by the vast wilderness of Yosemite. There were mentions of strange sightings over the years, unexplained lights in the sky, eerie sounds echoing through the valleys, whispers of a creature lurking in the shadows. But nothing concrete, nothing that could explain what happened to my family. Next, I went to the park itself. It felt strange being back there, the towering trees and cascading waterfalls now imbued with a sinister aura. I talked to park rangers, old-timers who'd spent their lives in the shadow of those ancient mountains. They shared stories of missing hikers, unexplained phenomena, and local legends that sent shivers down my spine. One ranger, a grizzled man named Hank, told me about the Whispering Man, a shadowy figure said to roam the deepest parts of the park, luring lost souls to their doom. He spoke of ancient spirits, guardians of the forest, who punished those who dared to trespass on their sacred grounds. Hank's words echoed in my mind as I hiked the trails, my senses heightened, my every instinct screaming at me to turn back. I felt watched, followed, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the distant calls of birds, every sound seemed amplified, every shadow pregnant with unseen danger. Back at home, I continued my investigation, scouring the internet for any information, any clue that could shed light on Sarah's disappearance and her cryptic warnings. I stumbled upon forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena, websites filled with chilling tales of encounters with the unknown. One post, in particular, caught my attention. It spoke of a group of hikers who'd vanished in Yosemite years ago, their bodies never found. The author claimed they'd been taken by creatures that resembled humans but possessed supernatural abilities, creatures that could blend into the shadows, manipulate minds, and erase memories. The description sent a chill down my spine. It aligned with Sarah's fragmented memories, her warnings about them watching, her unnatural agility and aversion to sunlight. Was it possible that she'd been taken by these creatures? And if so, what had they done to her? Driven by a desperate need for answers, I decided to search Sarah's room. I knew it was an invasion of privacy, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that something was terribly wrong. Under her bed, hidden in a dusty box, I found a journal. Its pages were filled with bizarre drawings, twisted figures with elongated limbs, swirling symbols that seemed to writhe and pulsate on the page, and cryptic messages scrawled in a language I didn't recognize. As I flipped through the pages, a wave of nausea washed over me. The drawings were disturbing, nightmarish, filled with a raw energy that seemed to vibrate off the page. And the words, though indecipherable, seemed to whisper dark secrets, hinting at a reality beyond human comprehension. One phrase, repeated several times, caught my eye: the walker in the woods. It was accompanied by a drawing of a shadowy figure with antlers, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the truth. Sarah wasn't just suffering from amnesia. She was hiding something terrifying. And whatever it was connected to the dark entity that lurked in the woods of Yosemite. The journal was a bombshell, a terrifying glimpse into the abyss that had swallowed my sister. I knew I had to confront her, to demand answers, but the fear was a suffocating weight on my chest. What if she couldn't remember anything? What if she turned violent, her mind twisted by whatever had happened in those woods? Despite the fear, I couldn't let it go. I had to know, even if the truth was more terrifying than anything I could imagine. I found Sarah in the living room, staring blankly at the flickering television screen. The midday sun streamed through the windows, but she seemed oblivious to its warmth, her skin as pale as moonlight. "Sarah," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk." She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting mine with an unsettling intensity. "About what?" she asked, her voice flat and emotionless. I took a deep breath, clutching the journal tightly in my hands. "About this," I said, holding it up. "About what happened to you. About the walker in the woods." A flicker of recognition crossed her face, a fleeting shadow of fear in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't lie to me, Sarah," I said, my voice firm. "I know you remember. I know you're hiding something." She stood up abruptly, her movements fluid and predatory. "You shouldn't have found that," she hissed, her voice laced with a chilling anger. Tell me what's going on, I demanded, my heart pounding in my chest. Tell me what happened in those woods. She took a step closer, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. You don't want to know, she whispered, her breath warm against my cheek. It's better to forget. To remain ignorant. I can't forget, I said, my voice shaking. Not while Lily is still out there. Not while you're like this. A wave of sadness washed over her face, a fleeting glimpse of the sister I once knew. Lily, she murmured, her voice filled with a deep sorrow. She's lost. Lost to the walker. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What is the walker? She looked at me, her eyes filled with a chilling knowledge. It's the guardian of the woods, she said, her voice hollow. It feeds on lost souls, on fear and despair. It took Lily. And it took me. She described fragmented memories of being trapped in a dark place, surrounded by twisted creatures with glowing eyes. She spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, of a power beyond human comprehension. They erased my memories, she said, her voice trembling. They made me forget. But I can't escape. It's still inside me, watching, waiting. She clutched her head, her body racked with sobs. It's coming for you too, she cried. You can't escape it. No one can. I reached out to comfort her, but she recoiled as if burned. Don't touch me, she hissed, her eyes filled with fear. It's too late. You're already marked. Her words echoed in my mind, a chilling prophecy that sent shivers down my spine. I knew then that I was in over my head. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was something far more sinister, something that threatened to consume me whole. After that confrontation with Sarah, things took a sharp turn for the worse. The whispers, once faint and sporadic, became a constant chorus in my ears, a cacophony of voices vying for my attention. They hissed my name, taunting me with cryptic messages, promising to reveal the truth about Lily's fate if only I surrendered to their call. My sleep was plagued by nightmares, vivid and terrifying visions of the walker in the woods. I'd see its shadowy figure lurking in the corners of my room, its antlers scraping the ceiling, its glowing eyes burning into my soul. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the feeling of unseen eyes lingering long after the dream had faded. The line between reality and hallucination blurred. Shadows danced in my peripheral vision, objects moved inexplicably in the dead of night, and the scent of pine needles and damp earth would suddenly fill my apartment, transporting me back to that fateful day in Yosemite. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just stress, anxiety, the trauma of Sarah's return and the reawakened memories of our lost family. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The entity, the walker in the woods, was reaching out to me, its influence seeping into my life, poisoning my mind. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, the lights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. A cold dread gripped me as I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Suddenly, a voice whispered my name, close to my ear, sending shivers down my spine. I spun around, but there was nothing there. just the empty darkness and the pounding of my own heart. Then I saw it. A shadow, tall and imposing, materialized in the corner of the room. It had the shape of a man, but its limbs were elongated, its movements jerky and unnatural. Antlers sprouted from its head, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I froze, paralyzed by fear, as the shadow glided towards me, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The shadow reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against my cheek. A wave of icy cold washed over me, and I felt a presence inside my mind, a dark consciousness probing my thoughts, my fears, my deepest vulnerabilities. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the shadow vanished, leaving me trembling in the darkness. The lights flickered back on, casting a harsh glare on the empty room. I was alone, but I knew I wasn't safe. The entity was inside me now, its tendrils wrapped around my soul, its whispers echoing in my mind. I was trapped, caught in a web of fear and despair, and I knew that if I didn't find a way to break free, I would be lost forever, another victim claimed by the walker in the woods. Fear is a powerful motivator. It can paralyze you, trap you in a cycle of doubt and despair. But it can also ignite a fire within you, a desperate need to fight, to survive, to protect the ones you love. Sarah's warning echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked in those woods. But it also sparked a desperate hope. If the walker had taken Sarah and Lily, then maybe, just maybe, I could find them there. I knew it was a long shot, a reckless gamble. But I couldn't just sit back and wait for the entity to consume me. I had to do something, anything, to try and save my sisters. So, I packed a bag with essentials, a flashlight, a first aid kit, a compass, and a map of Yosemite. I also took Sarah's journal, hoping it might hold some clue, some hidden message that could guide me. I left a note for Grandpa, explaining where I was going and why. I didn't want him to worry, but I couldn't leave him in the dark. He deserved to know the truth, even if it was a terrifying one. The drive to Yosemite was a blur of adrenaline and fear. The familiar landscape, once a source of comfort and joy, now seemed ominous and threatening. The towering trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The whispering wind carried a chilling message, a warning to turn back, to leave this cursed place. But I couldn't turn back. I had to keep going, driven by a desperate hope and a love for my sisters that burned brighter than any fear. I parked my car at the trailhead, the same one we'd used all those years ago. The memories flooded back, vivid and painful, but I pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand. I followed the trail, my heart pounding in my chest, my senses on high alert. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the occasional rustle of a bird taking flight. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, symbols that matched the ones in Sarah's journal. They seemed to pulsate with an eerie energy, guiding me forward, deeper into the heart of the entity's domain. The air grew colder, the sunlight filtering through the dense canopy casting long, eerie shadows. I felt a presence watching me, following me, its unseen eyes burning into my back. Then, I saw it. A cave, hidden behind a curtain of vines and moss. An unnatural chill emanated from its depths, a sense of ancient evil that made my skin crawl. I knew this was the place. This was where the walker resided, where it held my sisters captive. Taking a deep breath, I pushed aside the vines and stepped into the cave. The darkness swallowed me whole, the silence broken only by the echo of my own heartbeat. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The cave walls were covered in strange symbols, the same ones I'd seen on the trees. They seemed to writhe and pulsate in the flickering light, their energy filling the air with a sense of dread. As I ventured deeper into the cave, I stumbled upon a pile of debris, broken branches, tattered clothing, a child's drawing of a family, faded and torn. My heart skipped a beat. The drawing was Lily's. I recognized her childish scribbles, her depiction of our family, happy and carefree. A wave of hope washed over me, followed by a surge of fear. Lily was here. She was alive. But what had she endured? What had the walker done to her? Then I heard it. A faint cry, echoing from the depths of the cave. A cry that sent shivers down my spine and ignited a fierce determination within me. Lily? I called out, my voice trembling. The cry came again, weaker this time, but unmistakable. It was Lily. She was alive, and she needed my help. With renewed purpose, I pressed on, following the sound of her cries deeper into the heart of the cave, into the unknown darkness where the walker awaited. The cave narrowed, the air growing thick with a primal fear that clung to the back of my throat. The flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing grotesque shadows and unsettling formations that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. The cries grew louder, closer, a desperate plea that spurred me onward. Finally, the tunnel opened into a cavern, vast and echoing. The air hung heavy with the stench of damp earth and something else, something ancient and foul that made my stomach churn. In the center of the cavern, a fire burned, casting an eerie glow on the scene before me. And there she was. Lily. She was huddled on the ground, her back against a rock wall, her knees drawn to her chest. Her clothes were tattered, her hair matted with dirt, but her eyes, wide and terrified, held a spark of recognition. Lily. I cried, rushing towards her. But something blocked my path. A figure, tall and imposing, stepped out of the shadows. The walker. It was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over its bones, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Antlers, gnarled and twisted, sprouted from its head, casting menacing shadows across the cavern walls. It raised a hand, its long, bony fingers reaching towards me. A wave of fear washed over me, but I couldn't back down. Not now. Not when Lily was so close. Let her go. I shouted, my voice echoing through the cavern. The walker tilted its head, its eyes burning into mine. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. A low growl rumbled from its throat, shaking the very foundations of the cave. Then it spoke. Its voice was a guttural rasp, a sound that seemed to claw at the edges of my sanity. She belongs to the woods now, it hissed. Just like you. I lunged forward, desperation giving me strength. I tackled the creature, my hands finding purchase on its bony frame. It snarled, its breath hot and fetid against my face. We grappled, its unnatural strength pushing me back towards the edge of the fiery pit. Suddenly, a small figure darted past me. Lily. She was screaming, her hands outstretched towards the walker. No! I cried, reaching for her. But it was too late. The walker grabbed her, its long fingers wrapping around her tiny frame. It pulled her close, its face inches from hers. Lily. I screamed again, my voice raw with despair. The walker turned its head, its glowing eyes meeting mine. A cruel smile spread across its face, revealing its jagged teeth. Join us, it hissed. Become one with the woods. Then, it plunged Lily into the flames. The last thing I remember is the heat, the screams, the overwhelming sense of despair. The darkness closed in, swallowing me whole. I woke up in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nostrils. My head throbbed, my body ached, and a deep emptiness gnawed at my soul. Grandpa was there, his face etched with worry and relief. He told me they found me unconscious at the mouth of the cave, my clothes torn, my body covered in scratches. He said I'd been mumbling about monsters and flames, about Lily and Sarah. I tried to tell him what I'd seen, what had happened. But the words caught in my throat, the memories too horrific to articulate. He told me Sarah had disappeared again, vanished from her room without a trace. He said the police were searching for her, but they had little hope of finding her. I knew they wouldn't find her. She was gone, lost to the walker in the woods, just like Lily. And I was left with the echoes of their screams, the haunting images of their faces, the chilling knowledge that the entity was still out there, waiting, watching, its tendrils reaching out from the darkness, ready to claim its next victim.